Welcome back to the Qualified Expert series from Subthesis. The standing reminder: this course is education about the expert determination pathway, not a certification, and nothing here is legal advice. Module 4 begins today, and it is the module clients actually pay for: risk assessment. You have the measurement tools from Module 3. Now we aim them at somebody, because risk only means something once you decide who the attacker is. This is a long one, about 40 minutes, and it is arithmetic heavy on purpose, because the single most common weakness in a rejected determination is a risk section that describes adversaries without ever computing anything. Subscribe if the series is helping you, and the full roadmap is at subthesis.com. You cannot measure re-identification risk until you decide who is doing the re-identifying. That sentence separates a real expert determination from hand-waving. An attacker who knows their target is in your file faces a completely different problem than one who merely suspects it, and both differ from a data broker trying to identify everyone at once. The methodological literature, built largely by Khalid El-Imam, Fida Dankar, and colleagues, formalizes this into three named adversaries: the prosecutor, the journalist, and the marketer, each with its own formula, its own metric, and its own place in a determination report. Underneath all three runs a single, elegant equation that splits risk into two levers you control. Today, you learn the equation, the three adversaries, and the real-world attack scenarios they stand in for. We will not stop at definitions. We compute the prosecutor risk of every one of our 10 Springfield patients, one record at a time. We compute a journalist risk on a second, larger example, because Springfield is too small to show one. We compute all three metrics on the same file, so you can watch the hierarchy fall out of the arithmetic. And we finish by multiplying the two factors of the risk equation together, twice, once for a public release and once for an enclave, so you see exactly how controls buy back utility. This is the vocabulary your reports will be written in, and by the end, you will be able to write it in numbers. 5 objectives today. First, you will be able to apply the prosecutor model, the adversary who knows the target is in the data, and compute its maximum risk as 1 over the smallest class size, record by record, across a real table. Second, you will be able to apply the journalist model, the adversary without membership knowledge, anchored to population uniqueness rather than sample uniqueness, and we will compute a journalist risk end to end. Third, you will be able to apply the marketer model, the bulk attacker whose success is measured as an average across the whole file, and you will see all three metrics computed on one dataset, so the hierarchy is not something you memorize, but something you watch happen. Fourth, you will be able to estimate a population class size responsibly, which means computing a sampling fraction, choosing a named estimator by a published decision rule, and inventorying the outside data an adversary can reasonably reach. And fifth, you will be able to use the two-factor risk equation. Overall risk equals the probability of an attempt times the probability of success given an attempt, and multiply it out for two different release contexts. Equation first, because everything else is a piece of it. Every defensible determination rests on one decomposition. The overall risk of re-identification equals the probability that an attack is attempted, multiplied by the probability that the attack succeeds given that it is attempted. Two factors, two levers, and they are controlled by completely different things. The success factor is mathematical. It lives in the data itself, in the equivalence classes and the uniqueness you learn to compute in Module 3, and you lower it with transformation, generalize, suppress, shift, perturb. The attempt factor is behavioral and environmental. It lives in who receives the data and under what constraints, and you lower it with context, contracts that punish re-identification, vetted recipients, secure environments, audit rights. Here is the consequence that shapes all professional practice. When data goes to the open public, you must assume the attempt probability is 1.0. Somebody, somewhere, will try, and you have surrendered every environmental control, so the entire burden falls on transformation, and the data must be heavily protected. But in a controlled release, a strong contract and a locked-down environment genuinely drive the attempt probability down, which means the success factor can be tolerated somewhat higher, which means the data can stay richer and more useful. Read that back in regulatory language, and you hear video 5 again. Risk is judged per anticipated recipient. The equation is that principle turned into arithmetic. Notice also what the structure licenses. Because this is a product, a small number in either factor pulls the whole product down. So there are always two routes to a target, and the expert's job is to choose the allocation deliberately and write down why. The next two slides work the attempt factor. Then we spend the heart of this video on the success factor, because that is the half you can actually compute. So what actually moves the attempt probability? 4 families of factors, and your report should walk them in order. Family 1, the release model itself. Public release is the extreme case. Once a file is downloadable, you have relinquished all control over who takes it, what computing power they bring, and what they intend, so the attempt probability is conventionally assumed to be 1.0, and there is nothing left to argue. Everything below only matters in a controlled release. Family 2, contract terms. A data use agreement that explicitly prohibits re-identification, prohibits linkage to outside files, prohibits contacting individuals, and attaches real legal and financial consequences, converts a deliberate insider attack from a temptation into a breach of contract with a named remedy. That is a genuine reduction in attempt probability, and it is a reduction you can evidence by attaching the executed agreement. Family 3, recipient motive and trustworthiness. This is where you assess who you are actually handing the file to. An academic team working under institutional review board oversight, publishing under its own name, with careers that end if they are caught, carries a fundamentally lower motive to attack than a commercial data broker whose entire business model is joining consumer records to build profiles. Those two recipients do not deserve the same threshold, and saying so in writing is not favoritism, it is risk assessment. Family 4, security posture. Multi-factor authentication, role-based access control, encryption at rest and in transit, and monitored enclaves lower the probability that an outsider steals the file and links it at leisure. The recipient's perimeter is your perimeter, because a breach of their environment is a re-identification pathway you authorized. Document each family, direction of effect, and the evidence. There is a fifth dial, and it is the one beginners leave out because it cuts against the direction they want. The sensitivity of the payload itself raises the probability of an attempt. The methodological literature is explicit about this. Datasets carrying psychiatric records, substance use treatment data, HIV status, or precise genomic sequences have a higher target value to an extortionist, to a tabloid, to a hostile family member, and to a curious insider than a file of routine orthopedic encounters. Higher target value means more attackers willing to spend effort, which raises the baseline attempt probability, which means the same controls buy you less. This is why two datasets under identical contracts, identical enclaves, and identical demographics can honestly warrant different thresholds. Alongside motive sits severity, and the cleanest published vocabulary for it comes from the French Data Protection Authority, CNIL, which classifies the impact of a disclosure on an individual into three kinds: bodily impacts, physical harm, including violence, denial of care, or self-harm following exposure; material impacts, financial loss, insurance consequences, employment loss, denial of credit; and moral impacts, humiliation, stigma, damaged relationships, the collapse of a private life made public. A re-identified substance use record can produce all three at once, which is exactly why that payload deserves treatment a hip fracture file does not. Note how this interacts with the equation. Sensitivity raises the attempt factor, so to hold the product constant, you must lower the success factor, meaning more aggressive transformation. Write that reasoning down. A reviewer who sees a psychiatric dataset released at a permissive threshold with no discussion of payload sensitivity has found the weakest paragraph in your report, and they will start there. Adversary 1 is called the Prosecutor, and the name is a story. Imagine an attacker building a case against one specific person, and they already know, from outside knowledge, that their target is in the dataset. An employer who knows their employee was hospitalized that month, an ex-spouse, a neighbor. Membership is not in question, so the attacker's only job is to find which record is the target using the quasi-identifiers they know: age, sex, zip code. The math follows immediately. If the target's combination of values lands in an equivalence class of size k, the attacker picks among k candidates, and the probability of picking correctly is 1 over k. Because the prosecutor chooses the target, the honest summary of the dataset is its worst case, the maximum prosecutor risk, which is 1 over the smallest k in the file. Run Springfield. Raw, the smallest class is size 1, 8 times over, so the maximum prosecutor risk is 1 over 1, a certainty. An adversary who knows any of those 8 people is in the file identifies them without effort. Even the lucky pair, R01 and R03, sit at 1/2. When do you adopt this model? Whenever the recipient could plausibly know who is in the data, an internal analytics team, a small town context, a dataset covering everyone treated at one clinic. It is the most conservative choice. It always produces the highest number of the three, and when you cannot rule the scenario out, conservatism is what defensibility looks like. One more thing to hold on to before we compute it. The prosecutor number is not a prediction that anyone will actually do this. It is a statement about what the data permits, and what the data permits is the only thing you can honestly certify. Let us stop describing and start computing. Here's the whole Springfield discharge extract, fully synthetic, 10 fabricated rows using Springfield, Illinois zip codes for realism, with one extra column, the per record prosecutor risk. The rule is mechanical. Find the record's equivalence class on age, sex, and zip 5. Count how many records are in it. Write 1 over that count. Walk the file. R01, a 34-year-old woman in zip code 62704, shares her class with R03, so K equals 2 and her risk is 1/2, 0.5. R02, 36, female, 62704, is alone, K equals 1, risk 1.0. R03, the partner of R01, 0.5. R04, 51, male, 62701, alone, 1.0. R05, 52, male, 62701, alone, 1.0. R06, our 94-year-old woman in 62702, alone, 1.0. R07, 28, male, 62703, alone, 1.0. R08, 29, male, 62703, alone, 1.0. R09, 33, female, 62703, alone, 1.0. R10, 35, female, 62704, alone, 1.0. Now read two numbers off that single column. The maximum is 1.0. The mean is 8 times 1.0 plus 2 times 0.5, all divided by 10, which is 0.90. One column, two headline metrics, and the difference between them is the whole argument of the next several slides. Adversary 2 is the journalist, and again, the name tells the story. A reporter wants to prove your dataset is unsafe. They do not know whether any particular person is in it. They only know the file was drawn from some population, patients of a health system, residents of a region. They link your records against an outside register, a voter file, say, and claim a match. But here is their problem, and the key insight of the model. Finding a matching record proves nothing by itself, because the match is only certain if that combination of quasi-identifiers is unique in the population, not merely in your sample. If 5 men in the population share the demographics of one record in your file, the journalist's claimed match is right with probability 1 in 5. So journalist risk is anchored to population class sizes, the capital K from Module 3, not the sample K. That is why it is always less than or equal to prosecutor risk, and the hierarchy is worth memorizing. Prosecutor risk is greater than or equal to journalist risk, which is greater than or equal to marketer risk, always. Springfield makes the contrast vivid. R10 is sample unique, prosecutor risk 1.0, but thousands of 35-year-old women live in zip code 62704, so her journalist risk is tiny. R06, our 94-year-old, is the terror case. At her age, the population class may truly be size 1, and sample uniqueness and population uniqueness converge. Use the journalist model when membership knowledge is implausible, and the demonstration attack is the threat that matters. The next slide computes 1. Here is an honest admission about our teaching dataset. Springfield cannot demonstrate journalist risk at all. 10 records drawn from a ZIP3 area holding hundreds of thousands of people gives us no credible population counts to divide by, and any number I invented would be theater. So we borrow a second, larger toy from the methodological literature, use it once, and go back to Springfield afterward. The setup. 100 patient records drawn from a regional population of 10,000 individuals. The quasi-identifiers are age, sex, and 5-digit zip code. Focus on one record, a 45-year-old male in zip code 90210. In our sample of 100, exactly one record carries that combination, so the sample equivalence class size, little k, equals 1. But census tables for that area tell us 5 men in the population of 10,000 share those characteristics, so the population class size, capital K, equals 5. Now compute both models on the same record. The prosecutor knows this man is in the file. He queries, finds one matching record, and it is certainly his target. Prosecutor risk equals 1 over 1, which is 1.0. The journalist does not know whether the man was sampled. She queries, finds one matching record, and must ask whether this record belongs to her target or to one of the other 4 men who look identical on paper. Assuming the sample was drawn without favoring anyone, the record is her target with probability 1 over 5, which is 0.20. Same record, same file, same day, and the number moved by a factor of 5 purely because the adversary's background knowledge changed. That gap is the entire reason the report must name its adversary before it quotes a metric. I just handed you a population class size of 5 as if it were sitting on a shelf. It is not. True population counts for cross-classified quasi-identifiers, a 43-year-old Hispanic woman in a specific zip code with type 2 diabetes, essentially never exist, so the population parameter has to be statistically estimated, and the estimator you choose is a documented methodological decision. Start with one quantity, the sampling fraction, defined as the size of your release sample divided by the size of the population it was drawn from. In the toy on the last slide, 100 divided by 10,000 equals 0.011%. For Springfield, 10 records against the population of Zip 3 area 627 is a fraction far below 1%. Now the decision rule, established by Dankar, El-Imam, and colleagues through comparative Monte Carlo simulation. If the sampling fraction is below 10%, the Pittman estimator is the accurate tool and should be your primary choice. If the sampling fraction is at or above 10%, use the Zayat's estimator or the slide negative binomial estimator, choosing between them by the variance you observe. That is the whole rule, and it is citable, which is why it belongs in your report by name. Behind the rule sits a comparison of superpopulation model families, the Poisson gamma model, the Poisson log normal model, the Dirichlet multinomial model, the logarithmic series model, and the Ewens model, evaluated against those specialized estimators. Pittman's model is a Bayesian estimator built on the Pittman sampling formula, which generalizes the Ewens sampling formula, and it performs best exactly where health releases live, at very low sampling fractions. Both our examples sit far below 10%, so both are Pittman territory. Name the fraction, name the rule, name the estimator. The rule text says risk is judged against reasonably available information, and that phrase is not decoration. It is an instruction to inventory, in writing, the outside data an adversary can actually reach. Practitioners operationalize it by assuming 3 tiers of auxiliary data are available. Tier 1, Public Registers. Voter registration files are the canonical example, widely purchasable or freely downloadable depending on the state, carrying exact names, residential addresses, dates of birth, party affiliation, and voting history. That is the file that produced the Governor Weld attack, and it is still there. Tier 2, Official Statistical Products. Bureau of the Census tables and the American Community Survey give block-level and tract-level counts of age by sex by race, which is what you use to anchor the population denominators the journalist model needs. These do not identify anyone by themselves. They tell you how many people could be confused with each other, which is exactly the capital K you cannot otherwise observe. Tier 3, Commercial data brokers who compile household composition, credit reporting data, real estate transactions, purchase histories, and consumer marketing profiles at a granularity that embarrasses the public registers. Now the operational step that most beginners skip. Take your candidate quasi-identifier list and measure it against the variables those files actually carry. A variable is a quasi-identifier because something outside your file also holds it, so if no reachable auxiliary source records it, the linkage story is weak, and if voter files and broker profiles both carry it, the linkage story writes itself. This inventory is what converts your quasi-identifier classification from an assertion into an argument, and it is a named section of the report in video 13. Adversary 3 abandons targeting altogether. The marketer wants volume. Re-identify as many records as possible. Build a mailing list. Enrich a commercial profile. Feed a data broker. They link every record in your file against an external database and accept that plenty of matches will be wrong, because wrong matches cost them little and right ones are profit. Since no specific person is the target, a worst-case metric misdescribes the attack. The honest measure is the average, the expected proportion of records correctly re-identified across the entire file. Each record in a class of size k contributes a success probability of 1 over k, and you average those contributions over all records. Compute Springfield raw using the exact column you built 2 slides ago. 8 singletons contribute probability 1.0 each. The pair contributes 0.5 each. The average is 8 times 1.0 plus 2 times 0.5 divided by 10, which is 0.90. 90% of the file expected to fall to a bulk linkage attack. For contrast, after the generalizations in video 12, the same average drops to about a third, still failing any defensible threshold, and honestly so. A 10-row toy cannot pass, but the direction and the mechanics are exactly what you will do on real data. When is averaging legitimate? When the realistic threat is bulk and commercial rather than targeted, and often as a complement, reporting marketer risk alongside a worst-case model. What you may never do is quote the flattering average to a client whose real threat is a prosecutor. Now let us finish the second toy, because it is the only place we can watch all 3 numbers come off one file. Recall the setup. 100 records drawn from a population of 10,000. One record, the 45-year-old man in zip code 90210, is sample unique with a population class of 5. The remaining 99 records sit in 11 equivalence classes of 9 records each, and 11 times 9 is 99, so the file is fully accounted for. Prosecutor risk first. It is the maximum of 1 over k across the file. The worst class has k equal to 1, so prosecutor risk is 1.0. Journalist risk second. It is anchored to population classes, and the worst population class has capital K equal to 5. So journalist risk is 1 over 5, 0.20. Marketer risk third, and this one needs the average. The unique record contributes 1 over 1, which is 1.0. Each of the 99 records in classes of 9 contributes 1 over 9. Sum them. 1.0 plus 99 times 1/9. 99 divided by 9 is 11 exactly. So the numerator is 1 plus 11, which is 12. And the average is 12 divided by 100. 0.12. Line them up. Prosecutor 1.0, journalist 0.20, marketer 0.12. Prosecutor is greater than or equal to journalist, which is greater than or equal to marketer. You did not assume the hierarchy. You computed it, and it will hold on every file you ever touch, because population classes are never smaller than sample classes, and averages are never larger than maxima. A factor of 8 separated the highest and lowest numbers on the last slide. from 1.0 down to 0.12, and nothing about the data changed. That is why the selection rule for maximum versus average deserves its own slide. The rule is not a preference. It follows from the attack. If the adversary picks the target, the dataset is only as safe as its most exposed record, because that record is the one the adversary will pick. Prosecutor and journalist models are therefore evaluated at the maximum, meaning no single record in the file may exceed the threshold. If the adversary does not pick the target and simply harvests whatever the linkage yields, then a single exposed record does not characterize the attack, and the expected proportion of correct matches across the file is the honest summary. Marketer risk is therefore evaluated as an average. Now the uncomfortable part. Averaging is enormously friendlier to your client. Under a maximum rule, one stubborn outlier like Springfield's 94-year-old forces transformation on everyone, and utility dies for the whole file to protect one row. Under an average rule, that outlier is one term among thousands and barely moves the mean, so the data stays granular and the analysis stays useful. That is a real benefit, and it is legitimate when the threat is genuinely bulk. It is misconduct when it is not. If your client faces an insider who knows exactly who is in the file, and you quote the average because it is the number that passes, you have written a report that is arithmetically correct and professionally worthless. The metric follows the adversary follows the context, and the context is written down before either number appears. If you open a de-identification tool and wonder why a risk estimate takes minutes instead of milliseconds, this slide is the answer. For sample-based prosecutor risk, the computation really is as simple as it looked. Group the records, count each class, take one over the count, aggregate to a maximum or a mean. The formal statement in the literature uses an indicator function that fires when an equivalence class size equals 1, which is just a precise way of saying uniqueness gets probability 1. You could do it in a spreadsheet, and for Springfield we just did. The complexity arrives with the population. The journalist model needs capital K, and capital K is not observed, it is estimated, which means it does not arrive as a single number. It arrives as a distribution with uncertainty attached, produced by Pittman or Zayats or the slide negative binomial fitted to your sample. You cannot simply divide by an estimate and pretend it is exact. So the standard implementation runs a Monte Carlo simulation over many trials. Each trial draws population class sizes consistent with the fitted model, evaluates the per-record indicator against those drawn sizes, and aggregates to a maximum or an average. Across thousands of trials, you get a distribution of the risk metric, and you report from that distribution, often conservatively, at an upper bound rather than the mean, because a threshold you clear only on average is not a threshold you clear. Two professional habits follow. First, report the estimator and the sampling fraction next to the number, because the number is meaningless without them. Second, keep the simulation seed and the parameters in your working papers, because a determination that cannot be reproduced cannot be defended. The three named models are mathematical costumes for real scenarios, and your report must name the real scenarios too. The standard taxonomy has four. First, the deliberate insider. The data recipient, or someone inside their walls, intentionally re-identifies, breaching trust and usually a contract. This is prosecutor country. Insiders often know who is in the data. Second, spontaneous recognition. The quietest and most underestimated attack. An analyst is not attacking at all, then recognizes a neighbor, a relative, a famous patient, from a rare diagnosis, an unusual age, a familiar date. No algorithm involved, and no contract clause can fully prevent recognition. It is why extreme records like Springfield's R06 get suppressed rather than argued about, and why the OCR guidance flags recipients who might know people in the data. Third, breach of the recipient. The recipient is hacked, and your de-identified file escapes into hands you never assessed, to be linked at leisure. This is why the recipient's security posture belongs inside your risk analysis. Their perimeter is your perimeter. Fourth, the demonstration attack. An academic or a journalist re-identifies a few records to prove a point. No harm intended to patients, maximum harm delivered to the data custodian's reputation. Journalist model by name and by nature. Each scenario moves a different dial. Insider and recognition scale with who the recipients are. Breach scales with their security. Demonstration scales with how public and how interesting the release is. Notice too what is absent from the taxonomy. Not one of these four scenarios involves an attacker who simply guesses. Every one of them runs on outside information, which is why the inventory of reasonably available information is analysis rather than paperwork. Map the scenarios, pick the models honestly, and the risk numbers you compute will mean what your report says they mean. The next slide turns that mapping into a table you can lift straight into a determination. Here's the mapping written out, and I want you to treat it as a template rather than a truth, because your engagement may justify different pairings so long as you argue them. Row 1, the deliberate insider. Insiders usually know who is in the file, so the adversary model is the prosecutor, the metric is maximum risk, and the primary control is the contractual prohibition on re-identification backed by audit rights, because you cannot engineer away a trusted user, you can only deter and detect. Row 2, spontaneous recognition. Also prosecutor, because the recognizer knows the person and knows they were treated there, and also maximum risk, because it only takes one recognizable record. But the control is different. No clause stops the human eye, so the control is data side. Suppress or generalize the records that are recognizable on site, which in Springfield means the 94-year-old. Row 3, breach of the recipient or onward resale of the file. Here the attacker has no target, they harvest, so the marketer model fits, and the metric is average risk. The controls are the recipient's security assessment plus the onward transfer limits in the agreement, because both of those bound how the file escapes and what happens next. Row 4, the demonstration attack by an academic or journalist. No membership knowledge, so the journalist model, evaluated at the maximum because a single successful match is the headline. The control is analytical, a defensible population uniqueness estimate with a named estimator, because the way you lose this one is by having never checked capital K at all. 4 rows, 4 arguments, and every cell traceable. And notice the dependency running left to right. The scenario chooses the model chooses the metric, and only then does a control make sense, because a control that mitigates the wrong scenario is expense without protection. We opened with the equation. Let us close by multiplying it out twice on the same underlying data. Release 1, public, a file anyone can download, so the attempt probability is 1.0 by convention. To protect it, we transform hard until the maximum success probability reaches 0.09, which is the public benchmark you will meet properly in the next video. Multiply. 1.0 times 0.09 equals 0.09. Release 2, the same source data into a secure enclave. A named academic recipient under an executed agreement, reaching the data through a remote desktop with export and printing disabled, inside a monitored environment with audit logs. Suppose we assess the attempt probability at 0.05. Because the attempt factor did so much work, we tolerate a much higher success factor, a maximum risk of 0.20, which means far less transformation and far more clinical detail preserved. Multiply. 0.05 times 0.20 equals 0.01. Read that result carefully. The enclave release is granular enough to keep exact dates and specific diagnosis codes, and its overall risk is 1%, which is lower than the heavily transformed public release at 9%. That is the whole argument for context adjustment in 2 lines of arithmetic. Now the honesty note, and please do not skip it. That 0.05 attempt probability is not measured. Nobody has a base rate for how often vetted academic recipients attack files. In practice, experts argue the attempt factor qualitatively, catalog the controls, and conclude in words that the probability is low, then quantify only the success factor. Presenting a precise attempt probability you cannot source is worse than presenting none. Let us convert 40 minutes of theory into the section you will actually write, in the order a reviewer reads it. Item 1. Name the release model and the anticipated recipients before anything numeric appears. Public download, agreement-governed transfer, or enclave access, and who specifically. Every number after this depends on it, and a reviewer who cannot find this paragraph stops trusting the rest. Item 2. Catalog the attack scenarios you considered, all 4 of them: deliberate insider, spontaneous recognition, breach of the recipient, and demonstration attack, and say which ones are plausible here and why. Ruling one out is fine. Ruling one out silently is not. Item 3. Adopt your adversary models explicitly: prosecutor, journalist, marketer, or a combination, and tie each adoption to a scenario from Item 2. Item 4. State whether you are evaluating at the maximum or the average, and give the reason, which will be a sentence about whether the adversary chooses the target. This is the single most challenged sentence in the section, so write it as if it will be quoted back to you. Item 5. Show the numbers. Not a claim that risk is low, the computed values, with the equivalence class distribution behind them. Item 6. If any journalist-style metric appears, disclose the sampling fraction, the estimator you selected, the decision rule that selected it, and the simulation settings. Item 7. Inventory the reasonably available information you modeled, by name, voter files, census tables, broker products. Item 8. Describe the attempt factor qualitatively, list the controls it rests on, and state plainly that it is a reasoned conclusion rather than a measured rate. 8 items, and your risk section is defensible. One caution: that is the order a reviewer reads, not the order you work in. You will compute first and write last, and the writing will send you back to recompute at least once. 3 takeaways from a long session. First, the equation. Overall risk is the probability of an attempt times the probability of success given the attempt. Transformation controls the second factor. Context and contracts control the first. Public release forces the attempt factor to 1.0, and we multiplied it out both ways. 1.0 times 0.09 gives 0.09 for the public file. 0.05 times 0.20 gives 0.01 for the enclave. Second, the 3 adversaries and their metrics. The prosecutor knows the target is in the file and is scored at the maximum, 1 over the smallest class, which for raw Springfield is 1.0 across 8 records. The journalist lacks membership knowledge, is anchored to population uniqueness, and on our second toy computed to 0.20, where the prosecutor computed 1.0. The marketer attacks in bulk, is scored as an average, and computed to 0.12 on that same file against a Springfield average of 0.90. Prosecutor at least, journalist at least, marketer, always, and choosing among them honestly is an ethical act, not a technical one. Third, Population risk is estimated. Compute the sampling fraction, apply the published decision rule, name Pitman below 10% and Zayats or the slide negative binomial above it, and report the estimator with the number. Next video, the number itself, where thresholds come from and how to defend yours. Video 9 answers the question every client asks: what number is small enough, with traced precedents from CMS California and the clinical trial transparency world, plus a worked complementary suppression and 2 releases of Springfield at 2 different thresholds. Subscribe so it reaches you, and the roadmap is at subthesis.com.